Welcome to Systemic Societal Health, the podcast that explores how the science of energy networks creates a logical, practical, rigorous, and heartwarming understanding of what goes into building healthy, durably vibrant human networks. I'm your host, Dr. Sally Gerner, Research Director for Edinburgh University's Planetary Health Lab. Hello, today we'll be talking with Dr. Laura Lengnick about her work using resilience principles to explore how an integrated approach to managing assets can reduce risks, capture new opportunities, and cultivate resilience in business, government, or community organizations. Author of Resilient Agriculture, Cultivating Food Systems for a Changing Climate, Dr. Lengnick is award-winning agricultural and food system science and a principal at Cultivating Resilience, LLC, a consulting firm offering best management practices and leading edge resilience and assessment and planning services to help business, governments, and communities manage risks, capture opportunities, and cultivate resilience. So welcome to the program, Dr. Lengnick.
Thanks. It's good to see you, Sally.
Nice to see you too.
Please call me Laura.
Okay, I shall. So, I'm particularly interested in the economic way you argue for these kinds of practices in economic terms. What kinds of things do you use when you're approaching businesses?
Yeah, so the way that typically I actually am approached by business is that they're interested in seeing what resilience thinking might be able to do for their business. So it's not so much that I am out there trying to sell it, although obviously I do what I can to share case studies and stories. But more than anything, I think businesses are just curious to find out what resilience thinking is and how they might be able to use it. And so, for example, I have done several projects now with small businesses I'm based in Asheville, North Carolina, and I've done several projects now with small businesses. They have maybe 100 employees. They're maybe 6 million total income. And they have reached out to me to find out, what is this resilience thing? How might they use it? And in particular, because a lot of my work is associated with climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, they're interested in how they might be able to enhance the resilience of their business while they reduce their carbon footprint. So that's a pretty great example of how I work with businesses, where cost savings come in, or that sort of question is really, once we get into the details of understanding the value network of the business. So that's a little bit different than the supply chain or the value chain, because the value network which is a resilience thinking concept. The value network is looking both upstream of the business and downstream of the business, and thinking about that network as what that business depends on to be successful. So both the suppliers and the distributors and customers, they're all important to the resilience of the business. And so we look into that value network and begin to look at how we might be able to improve relationships so that we're enhancing the resilience of the business, because the entire value network, the business is looking out at its value network and looking at ways that it can increase the benefit to both sides of the relationship, wherever it might be in the value network.
And
so
go ahead.
Just was going to say, and so sometimes that does involve savings. Sometimes it involves greater costs, and so it's up to the business owners or the managers to decide if that cost is worth the benefit.
So can you give me a concrete example of how you improve a relationship with a supplier, say, if you're...
Yeah. So, for example, I worked with a manufacturing business here in Asheville, and they count on regional suppliers of materials and I'm not being very specific because I don't want to be very specific, but
Okay.
I'm not prepared anyway to start naming businesses and that sort of thing. But basically, they have raw materials that they source in the Southeast, and that is part of their value proposition to their customers that they're doing regional sourcing.
Uh-huh.
So one way that we looked at to improve their relationships with their suppliers is that they reached out to their suppliers and gave them and started a discussion about how their suppliers might be able to reduce emissions.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so they're providing essentially consulting services to their suppliers, just through building relationships and talking about how the suppliers might be able to support the value proposition that they have created in their own business, but they're now going back through the supply chain and having those conversations with other suppliers. So they're building, you can think of it as they're building, um, increasing the ability of suppliers to also begin to look at emissions, other kinds of environmental impacts. And very often when you begin to look at that, you can find savings. But it's really not about savings. In fact, I would argue that that over focus, that extreme focus on just the cost of production or the sales price is what has led to a lot of the damage that we see
Well, and
from
I
business.
agree. Now, and how much of it, I mean, do these same kind of techniques work on really large businesses, or is it mostly going to be small and medium-sized businesses that are going to be able to have these kinds of conversations?
I don't have experience with large businesses, but I do keep track of the kinds of guidance that is being put out by the big risk management companies that work with the really large, the global corporations, and they are all providing the same kind of guidance, that we can no longer simply exploit our suppliers. We need to begin to cultivate their resilience and the sustainability of their businesses in order for us to continue to operate. So I feel like I'm on very strong ground as I work with smaller businesses, because this message, the example I just gave you, is common at this point, very common in resilience management of global corporations as well.
Actually, so you also mentioned that you do assessment of resilience. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things we're talking about doing with the RARE group, the Research Alliance for Regenerative Economics, is consulting in impact investing. And impact investing is very big on how do you measure the social impacts. Now, one of our measures actually has to do with, whether the activity is more constructive or more extractive.
Mm-hmm.
And so this seems like it would sort of fit into what you're talking about you could.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I see very clearly the relevance of the regenerative economics metrics that RARE has been working with and presented in a number of papers. And it's much needed, in my opinion, in the impact investing world. I think there is a lot of greenwashing going on in the impact investing world. And I'm not the only one. And so I think having a solid set of metrics would really bring a lot of integrity to that world.
Well, and it's not only the environmental aspects that not only the greenwashing per se, but it's also kind of like the human aspects that get overlooked a lot.
Yes, absolutely. And I meant to, that was included. I just used, do we have a color for justice? I don't know. But absolutely. It's actually, I would say that is the weakest, that justice, that equity part, that human equity part is where impact investing is very weak. So I'm excited about some of the new metrics that RARE has been involved in developing.
Yeah. Okay. So you also I mean, what you're tacitly doing is changing the human network because you're working on their relationships, but you're doing it under the sort of like the guise of resilience and climate change, and making your business more sustainable because you're making it more adaptable and more resilient.
Yeah.
Um, do you,
But I would stop you to say it's not under the guise of resilience. I mean, so I got into this work as a natural scientist. I was very much thinking about ecosystems, ecosystem health, and the effect of pollution on the environment and all of that. So very much natural science.
right?
I got interested in resilience as a solution to adapting agriculture to climate change. But what I found as I started to learn about social ecological resilience, which is a very specific kind of resilience thinking, what I learned was that the social part is equally or even more important than the ecological part. And as I learned more and began to apply some of these ideas, what became very clear to me is that what has really been degraded in industrialism is the people part.
It's the human networks. Yeah.
Human networks, communities. Certainly, environment is key. It's the foundation of our well-being, but it's the people part of this picture, which we could call it industrialism that has exploited, degraded those resources. A word that I learned from the youth movements going on now that I think fits really well is colonialism. It's colonialism that has degraded human networks, and it's degraded human networks because has exploited people and their communities.
I call it oligarchic capitalism because it's
I
not free enterprise the way we tend to think of it, which is very compatible with having common cause relationships with both your suppliers and your customers. Uh,
Yes,
it's
and I love that you call that what you call it, but I can't even pronounce that.
Sorry about that.
No, it's great, but yeah, we're what I find so fascinating now. I'd say I've been really seriously doing resilience work for 15 years or so, and what I find really fascinating is what I see happening all over in all different sorts of communities of practice is that this sense that we can no longer exploit people is really rising. It's
Yeah.
bubbling up all over. And that's exciting to me because I think that's a root cause of a
Oh,
lot of our wicked problems.
yes, I think so too. I mean, I think our Rare's main point is that the goal is to build healthy human networks because that's what you need in order to have environmental sustainability or economic vitality. Both of them are both dependent upon having healthy human networks. And then it's a
Yes,
matter of what goes into creating a healthy human network.
yes. And that, I think that aspect or the human part of all of these big picture issues, these wicked problems, whatever you'd like to call them, um, I think that has been uh, less of a focus over the last, say, 50, 60 years, because it's really hard to accept what that means for us.
Say more. What do
Um,
you mean? What does it mean for us?
well, because I think that a lot of us in this work, I'm making a very broad generalization now, but I'd say, fairly well educated, white, middle class people. It's hard to accept or really look at straight at and begin to acknowledge that our good life has been built on a foundation of exploitation.
Yeah.
And so it can be really I think as I get more into this work, um, I see that there I see that there's a good reason why we have failed to really get into this root cause. And it's because it's hard. It's been very hard work for me to actually look at how the suffering that underlies my good life as a white, middle class, well educated American.
Okay, so so we've got
Sorry,
now.
that
Do you
might have
focus
been
it? No. I mean, I think it's essential. But okay, part of me is a psychologist. All right,
Mhm.
and one of the reasons I call it oligarchic is because oligarchy is a type of hierarchy. It's a hierarchy that is designed to serve the guys on top, and it is specifically exploitative and extractive.
Yeah.
But it's an equal opportunity corrupter. So the same process that makes colonialism and imperialism horrible is also what made the Catholic Church priests feel that they had impunity to exploit, to be pedophiles, or the current round of politicians. There's a lot of that going on in there too. But you also see it in science, where I just watched a Nova program called Picture of a Scientist, which was all about basically sexism in science and STEM
Yeah.
fields.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
most of the people involved don't have any clue that, and they really don't see themselves as being biased or having all that, but they actually have ways of measuring that. It just from a recurrent association over time between this is what a woman does and this is what a man does, and it's the same thing. This is what a black person does and this is what a white person does, or this is
Yep.
what a middle class person, or this is what a poor person does. That
Yep.
all of those things are basically, your brain gets wired to make common associations, and so we are all innately biased in these various ways. But to get out of it, I think we have to focus on fairness for everyone.
Yeah, and from where I stand, in my work, which is a lot rooted in food system, it's the food justice. The most recent thinking around food justice is not so much fairness, but equity and reparation, and recognizing the damage that's been done and doing what we can to repair that damage as we move forward. So that's sort of the leading edge of that kind of thinking. The other thing I would say, my overall reaction to you saying, well, people honestly don't know. I think that I want to take a cue from the youth movement. I was really moved over this last year about the way by the way that the youth of this country have stood up and said, climate change, we've got to start dealing with it. Racism, we've got to start dealing with it. We're no longer going to just accept this. And so I think by now, I really can't give anyone a pass on not recognizing that there's very likely racism, sexism, ageism, all the isms operating in whatever profession they're in. And I certainly feel a lot of compassion for people that's a new idea to them. But I think I wanted to give a nod to the youth leaders of this country and say, they are on the right track here.
Okay.
And I at least want to help them and to support what they're doing. And then to bring this back to resilience, it's absolutely in line with resilient community that we are beginning to confront some of these very
Absolutely.
exploitive relationships. It's absolutely in line with resilience thinking. So it's very exciting to me, actually, to see the kinds of conversations we're having today compared to, I don't know, 5 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I think for me, it's more of a. I mean, obviously, from a psychologist's point of view, we are innately biased because we are a product of how we were raised and what we were exposed to, and the whole pink blankets and red and yellow and blue blankets rather. But the question is, how do you get fairness going, or equity if you want,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that isn't unfair to the people who benefit
Who's
from.
had more status.
Yeah.
I think that's why that's the trap that using the word fair gets you into, because I think there's no doubt that equity means that those of us that have had more than our share will have to share what we have with those that have had less. And I know that's a scary idea. And yet this country is incredibly wealthy. And
Oh,
I think we have plenty enough to go around. But I realize that's a pretty radical
oh,
notion.
hey, my daughter who is now 30 something, when she was in 6th grade, she did this paper on, it was about maximum wage. And there's this whole book on why it
Mm-hmm.
turns out that since George Washington and around that period, this Revolutionary War period, they were already looking at the idea that you shouldn't allow some people to extract from their company excessive benefits. That's, a product of many people's labor. But because they have a particular position in there, they should be able to just do, whatever. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we're just living in a really gross version of that whole principle, which is,
Yeah.
I mean, in economics, in theory, what happens is the reason you want to give tax breaks to corporations is so that they will reinvest it in their people and their plans and things. But that's not what they do anymore. So it's all.
No. And they haven't done it, as I understand it. I'm no economist, but they haven't done it for 30 or 40 or 50 years. I
Oh,
mean, it's been
yeah.
a very long period of incredibly damaging
Right.
behavior.
Right.
So, and there's all sorts of other ideas around this idea of sharing or limiting. The way I think about it from a resilience perspective is we are, as a community, deciding for the good of the community to limit the accumulation of wealth,
Absolutely.
to limit how much wealth can be held by individuals. And we have so many good ideas out there about how to do that. One person that's coming to mind is Chuck Collins.
Huh.
He is I'm not going to remember right now the name of the group that he leads. It's in Washington. Maybe if I talk about it a little bit, I'll remember. But here's what I do remember about him, which when I read the first thing I ever read written by him, he turns the whole idea on its head. He says, we don't have a poverty problem in this country. We have a wealth problem. And the minute that we start thinking about it that way, we can start imagining solutions.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, another from an agriculture point of view, another great movement that actually was, I think of as out of the Catholic religion. You mentioned priests just a little while ago, but there was this type of philosophy called the distributionists. Have you ever heard of that whole movement? It was distributionist. I'm pretty sure it's related to Catholic theology, but it was really strong in the Midwest during the Depression, and it was behind the mutual aid
Oh,
societies that were created all over at least it was an agrarian. It rose in the agrarian communities in the U.S. And they started mutual aid societies. And so again, that's a great example of communities coming together and recognizing that we all need to share.
yeah.
That everyone's well-being is founded in sharing the wealth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so,
I'll follow up after this and get you something about Chuck Collins, just since I've mentioned him. But really, really interesting work that he's doing with lots of very specific policy and individual ideas for both organizations, for governments, and for individuals to begin on their own right now sharing their wealth. So very, very excellent work being done there. Very practical.
I'm back to, if you're one of the people who actually produces something, you're a worker, whatever you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
whether you're sweeping floors or inventing a new drug or something, everybody should get an equitable share of the rewards, and you shouldn't have these special class of people called either the managers or the shareholders, who get to take as much as they want and orient the entire rest of the system just to be basically suck wealth up. And at this point in life, they have studies about how much shorter the average lifespan of a company is because of these kinds of practices. People don't really, they don't care if they're killing the company. And they've created this whole adversarial system where, you don't trust anybody because everybody's trying to rip you off at every turn. So anyway, I don't know how this is all going with resilience,
but it is all going with resilience because all of these, let's just use the broad overarching idea of cooperative business. I'm not meaning that in its very narrow legal sense here, but more cooperative kinds of businesses.
Right.
I mean, there's all sorts of models all over. B Corp is and one that's used here. Cooperatives are used here, but there's all sorts of different ways to organize businesses in a region or in some kind of network. Business alliances, for example, that create well-being that's equitable throughout the network. So it's not hard to think about how to do this, and we've got lots of excellent examples. The challenge is that right now it's difficult to convince people to move in that direction, including the progressive middle class. I've spent the last 4 months really digging into the history of equity in food systems in the US. And one of the things that has been so striking to me is how most of the investment, philanthropic investment, any kind of a government investment, all of the investment focused on reducing the harms of the food system. Nearly all of it actually helps to prop up the existing food system. And resilience theory, you can very clearly show that with resilience theory, that you can look at actions that are taken and very clearly and very simply, one idea is called an adaptive strategy. It's really called the adaptive continuum. And it lays out actions that are being taken in terms of whether they protect the system, whether they adapt the system. So it's an adjustment in the system, but essentially the same system is in place, or they transform the system. And I have done an analysis. I've done this actually for several clients. It's a very uncomfortable analysis for many progressive organizations. But if you analyze programs, analyze investments, what you see is that absolutely the majority of investments are maintaining the status quo, i.e., protecting the system.
Well, yes, and even in the physics, that's pretty much what happens when you get a positive feedback cycle going. So what you have is people who are selected to rise in the ranks, so the ones who reinforce the status quo, who serve the status quo, because that's why they get rewarded.
Yeah.
And then after a while, what you have is a whole bunch of people who are running the system who are dedicated to preserving the status quo, and everybody else, because it's a pecking order kind of process, is kind of afraid to step out of line, because if you do, you won't get anything out of the system.
Yeah, and so the folks that are really, I think, on the leading edge of real radical thinking around food system anyway, but I would be willing to bet this would be true of any system, any
Oh,
important critical community system. What they're arguing now is that the radicals need the progressives to join with them to make change happen.
yeah,
But right now, the progressives, which I think of, at least in terms of food, we're talking white middle class
yeah.
in
The
America,
people who can
in the
afford to do it
US.
organic and things like that. Yes.
That's right. Right now, the progressives are basically joining with the status quo. And so that there needs to be a shift. And for me, and in my work, that's actually an exciting finding because it means that we have real purpose. You know,
Ah,
my people
my people.
have real purpose. It's up to us to see the inequity, to decide we don't like it, and then to make changes. You
See,
know, we have that.
okay, so there's this thing called the diffusion of innovation, which talks of you'll recognize the
I
innovators,
will.
early adopters, early majority, things like
Yes.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, that's very indicative. We need to find the early majority people, and we need to talk to them in their own language because they're looking around at all this innovation going on, and what they don't want to do is swallow a poison pill. And there's a lot of poison pills, floating around in all of this, motherhood and apple pie and sweetness and light kinds of stuff. There's a lot of it's just hogwash. It's just made up stuff, you know.
Yep.
So part of what I see us as trying to do is to create an empirical grounding in this so that that this is real stuff that makes real improvements rather than just another, this is going to, resilience is the panacea and it's just going to solve everything kind of thing.
Right. I 100% agree with you. That is what gets me excited about RARE,
Yeah.
about what RARE is doing, is I think that those metrics are very well aligned with resilience theory as I understand it.
Yeah.
And it will give us some measures to begin to critically evaluate what we're doing. Very similar to, I told you, the adaptive continuum, that protect, adapt, transform. That's another good, I think I would love to spend some time. I would love to find some support in order to be able to spend some time to map the RARE metrics onto that continuum and start, so then we could do policy analysis with the metrics and begin to say, this policy, as well-meaning as it is
Right.
actually not changing anything.
Right. Well, that would be lovely.
Yeah. Okay,
so unfortunately, we've run out of time because we're supposed to try to keep these to about 40 minutes.
Okay. Now that's great.
But I'd like to do this.
I'd
actually like to do a part 2 of this because I would like to talk more about some specifics of what you do, and because you do a lot in actually building local food networks and regional food networks, right?
I do work more theory than actual hands-on work, but I work with organizations that do that. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm helping them think about resilience and how they can, what they're doing and what the real impacts are of what they're doing. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and how they could maybe just do some tweaking and actually really move their work into more of a transformative space.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for this lively discussion. And
thank you, Sally. It was fun.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.